Mozart was a prolific concerto writer, especially for his instrument, which was piano. He wrote 27 piano concerti, and the scholarship will debate whether he actually wrote 27, and perhaps some of the early ones are attributed to him, but really they were written by somebody else. I'll use the number 27 because that's the number you'll find in the Köchel catalog. This is number 20. It's in D minor, and we've talked a number of times at this point about the dichotomy between major and minor, and we'll revisit that once again at the piano, and we'll listen to a really wonderful performance by Mitsuko Uchida playing this really interesting concerto. I'll just say this before we talk about it. This was Beethoven's favorite Mozart piano concerto. So of the 27, this was the one that Beethoven, and I think many musicians after Beethoven, esteemed in the highest tier. And finally, we're going to spend the last part of the lecture talking about the Requiem, this very enigmatic work which is swirled in mystery, steeped in enigma. We're going to demystify all of that enigma because really we now know just about everything there probably is to know about this piece, although I do want to point out that we didn't know this, we being the music community, until the 20th century. So it has been, a lot of the mysteries have been solved, and we'll talk about that. Finally, we'll talk about the ultimate mystery, which is, of course, Mozart's death. How does a 35-year-old drop dead very suddenly? Was he poisoned? Was he the victim of some conspiracy? Or did he simply die of any number of causes that could have afflicted a person in the late 18th century in an era where medicine was, I think, comparatively quite primitive and sometimes could be detrimental to one's health to employ certain medications. As we'll see, that's one of the theories explaining Mozart's demise. Let me briefly sum up the last few years of Mozart's life before we get into the repertoire. Sometimes you'll read or you'll see in popular depictions of Mozart that his life was misery at the end, and that's simply not true. The movie Amadeus is somewhat guilty of doing this, that they depict the last sort of episodes of Mozart's life that he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown and that he was miserable and in debt, and he sort of giggles nervously because he is kind of almost deranged at that point in the movie. And that's probably not the case at all. It's probably likely that Mozart was feeling pretty good about himself, especially in the last year of his life in 1791. His wife, in the summer, gave birth to his second son, Franz Xavier. He was doing better as far as his work and his finances went, although he still had debts that he needed to pay off. He was, at this point, ensconced for 7 years in the Masonic Lodge in Vienna, which gave him a sense of fraternity and camaraderie and brotherhood and all these good things, which the sociologists say very healthy. One of the healthiest things you can have is community. So here we are, doing something, engaging in a very healthy activity. And yet, there are some things that we should address. Number one, his last few symphonies, for example, why were they written? 3 symphonies, 39, 40, and 41, all written within a span of probably no more than 60 days. You can imagine the notes just flying off the page, the complexity of writing a symphony of this scope, and doing it in this condensed time period. Scholars have no record of these pieces being performed during Mozart's own life. Now, you may say, well, what does that mean? What it means is that Mozart didn't write it for any particular patron, that he was probably writing it sort of, as they say nowadays, spitballing, trying to get some ideas to stick so that he could sell them to somebody on the off chance that he would receive an honorarium or a commission, a retrospective commission for writing these works. And of course he didn't. So tremendous amount of effort exerted in the summer of 1788 and no financial fruit from that labor. Although, of course, great artistic fruit. His last operas, The Magic Flute, Clemenza di Tito, not as successful as you might think based on their popularity today. In fact, quite a few of Mozart's operas did not do especially well during his own lifetime. The best example would be The Marriage of Figaro, which we did not have a chance to discuss. Figaro has a rather complex plot, so I didn't want to really get into it last week. But nonetheless, The Marriage of Figaro had a limited number of showings, probably no more than 7 or 8 showings before it was yanked from the stage. So his operas were not bearing the kind of fruit that he wanted. And it's probably due to these circumstances that late in his life, just a few months before he died, when he was approached by an anonymous commissioner, that is to say somebody came to him and did not identify himself, but said, I'm going to commission you to write a Requiem Mass, and here's how much we'll pay you, and we'll give you money up front, and so on and so forth, and if you work faster, you'll get more money. It's no surprise why Mozart took that on. It's also no surprise that while juggling all of these projects, he probably, as the movie Amadeus depicts him, became extremely fatigued and extremely overworked. There's a great scene in the movie where Mozart is sort of manically composing and playing billiards at the same time. And how do we know he's composing? Because we hear music, not diegetic music, but exegetic music. So in other words, music that the characters are not making, but we're hearing as viewers of the film. And there's a knock on the door which interrupts this episode. And it's Emanuel Schikaneder, the guy who wrote the libretto of the Magic Flute. And he comes to Mozart and he says, Mozart, where's the score? And Mozart says, don't worry, it's done. I finished it. And Schikaneder breathes a big sigh of relief. Wow. You had me really worried. I mean, we need to start rehearsals next week. I was worried that you hadn't even started the score yet. And Mozart says, no, it's complete. I finished it. And Schikaneder says, well, great, let me see it. And Mozart sort of starts to giggle. And Schikaneder gets a little sterner, and he says, Mozart, let me see the score. And Mozart says, well, I can't. And he says, where is it? And Mozart says, it's up here. Now, while the movie gets a lot of things wrong, I think that's one thing the movie gets absolutely right. That Mozart really did compose like that. That it was just like a stenographer's job to write it down. That's the hardest part of composing. Actually creating the music was not the challenge for him. We're going to start, as I said, by looking at the Jupiter Symphony, and it's about 26 to 28 minutes in a typical performance. We're not going to look at the whole thing. I want to turn our attention to the finale. The finale is really remarkable because what Mozart does is he crafts 4 themes, and they're themes of various sounds and difficulties. Let's listen to them. All right, did we catch that? This one's simple. Bum, 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 bum. Nice long notes. Bum, 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 bum. That's going to be our first theme. We get a second theme. Well, there's the first theme again. Here's the second theme. It's going to sound like this. Bum, ba, bum, ba, da, da, ba, da, ba, da, ba, da, ba, dum. Again. Third theme, excuse me. So we have this bum 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 ba da ba da ba da ba dum bum 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 ba da ba da ba da ba dum bum. Okay, that's our third theme, and finally our fourth theme. Okay, it's a little bit hard to hear it there, but it sounds something like this. Ba 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 bum ba bum ba 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 bum ba bum 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 ba bum ba bum. And most of these themes are what we call sequenced, meaning if you do ba 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 bum ba bum ba 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 bum ba bum, in other words, the intervals repeat just at lower or higher pitch levels. So what Mozart's going to do here is he's going to channel the spirit of all people, I think, Johann Sebastian Bach, because he's going to create what we call a contrapuntal texture here, which is a very fancy way of saying that he's going to have multiple independent voices. In other words, these themes that we hear, first, when this movement starts, we hear them separately, sequentially, in order. But what happens at the end, the coda, is that we're going to actually hear all of these themes played simultaneously. Now, that may not sound too impressive, but let me suggest that it is. And the reason it is because when we craft a musical line, and we want to play it simultaneously against another musical line, which is completely independent, we have to make sure they line up. What that means is that the notes have to fit. You can't have certain dissonances, for example, simultaneously. You can't have certain suspensions simultaneously if they don't resolve correctly. In other words, there's a lot of, let's say, rules on how notes have to behave when they interact independently. And of course, when I mentioned Bach was the master of independent contrapuntal music. The idea being that if we listen to a Bach piece, even a simple one, With Bach, we get this sense of independence. We get this sense of one voice is doing its own thing, another voice is complementing it, but doing its own thing, sometimes going in contrary motion, meaning sort of one note goes up, another line goes down, one is in long sustained tone, one is in running tones, one can be in dotted rhythms, bum, ba bum, ba bum, ba bum, that sort of thing, versus bum, ba 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 bum, or whatever the rhythmic profiles, they're going to be different. And so with Mozart, we usually don't encounter that. What we usually get with Mozart is what we call a homophonic texture, which essentially translates to something like melody and harmony in most cases, rather than melody and melody. And that's exactly what we don't get at the end here. We don't get homophonic texture. We get a decidedly polyphonic texture. This is one of those movements where historians and listeners often say, oh, well, this is the 41st Symphony, the last symphony. Can you imagine if Mozart had lived another X years? Because, again, the trajectory of his works, especially in these last few years, just goes up and up and up. And therefore, it really piques the imagination and tickles us as listeners because we imagine what might have happened had he lived a little bit longer. Let's listen to this. I prepared a Malinowski score that will sort of depict everything we want to see here in colors. So we'll see that the purple tinted colors, as you'll see when the lights come down, are string instruments, and the range of the instruments is going to be clear because the higher notes will be on top and the lower notes will be on bottom. So we'll listen for about 2 minutes and 40 seconds for what's called the exposition. Theme is about to start over because we're going to repeat what's called the exposition of the movement. Exposition means that first section where the main themes are outlined. And again, I think we heard most of those main themes there, right? And if we listen to this piece a number of times, they would become very familiar to us. The main theme, bum, 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 bum. One of the counter themes, ba 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 bum, ba bum, ba 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 bum, ba bum. Another counter theme, bum, bum, ba, ba da ba da ba da ba dum, bum, 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 ba, ba da ba da ba da ba dum, bum. And there are, of course, a couple more. When we get toward the end of the movement, and you can see that this movement is over 11 minutes long in a typical performance, so it's a massive tour de force. Let me go ahead and just point out, by way of comparison, that in the classical period, especially in the early classical period, the 1750s, 1760s, those early symphonies, you can have an entire symphony that's over in 11 minutes. You can have an entire symphony that's over in 9 minutes if you look at the early ones. So to have a single movement that's longer than entire symphonies from a few decades earlier, I think this is really paving the way for composers like Beethoven. Beethoven, of course, was famous, or I suppose, depending on your perspective, notorious for writing really long first movements. Maybe the most extreme example took place in the very early 19th century with Symphony No. 3 in E-flat major, the Eroica Symphony. For those who know that movement, that first movement is something like 17 minutes long, could be 18 and a half minutes. Really depends who's conducting and how much coffee they've had that day. So to have a movement here that's really pushing the boundaries of how much music you can fit into a single movement, and what that essentially boils down to is how much can you develop certain themes? And as we're going to see, Mozart develops them quite a bit. I'm going to jump to the end of the of what's called the recapitulation, and this will take us into the coda. That's not a rest that Mozart put in there, by the way. We're now heading into the final stretch, and we're going to head into what's called the coda. Coda means tail in Italian, and traditionally codas had been these little sort of throwaway sections, perhaps 8 measures, 12 measures, 16 measures, and it was just a way for the composer to kind of wrap the piece up, tie a nice little bow around it, and firmly establish the tonality of the piece. Of course, Mozart is going to go in a totally different direction here, and in that way he once again paves the path for Beethoven, whose codas would become the stuff of legend. And this ends Mozart's 41st Symphony in C major. Before we turn to the next piece, let's just say a couple more things about that particular symphony. I think it's fair to say that Mozart's last 2 symphonies especially, numbers 40 and 41, are special pieces. And if we were to do a survey and go around and see which concert halls are programming which symphonies around the world, especially in North America and in Europe, I would surmise that Mozart's last 2 symphonies get performed an awful lot. Certainly the most frequently performed of his symphonies. Number 40, we won't talk about tonight, but It's also a very forward-looking piece. It's in the unusual key for Mozart of G minor, unusual in that it's a minor key at all. Mozart, of course, as we're going to see in the next piece, and in fact in the Requiem as well, tended to avoid minor keys unless the situation called for it, or at least that's what we might extrapolate from the details of his life at certain times. We don't know. There's no one who can say, well, Mozart wrote in a minor key on this date because of this reason or that reason. We don't know. However, the 40th Symphony is a special piece, and of course the 41st Symphony might be the one symphony that Mozart wrote that tops it in the magnitude and the scope of what he was able to accomplish here. Again, he's 32 when he wrote this, so an impressive feat. We're now going to look at the D minor Piano Concerto, number 20. We won't spend too much time on it, but I thought it might be fun to look at the third movement of this one as well. Again, the key of D minor or any minor key, Mozart really prefers major keys for the most part. And if we think about his piano sonatas, they tend to be very buoyant, very positive in the affect that they project. They tend to be playful or mischievous, fun, you might say. Even the ones that are in minor tend to steer towards the major. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. First of all, the famous Rondo alla Turk, which starts in A minor. Movement comes from the end of the Sonata K331, and it starts in a minor key, right? But where does it really go? Well, the main sort of drive is towards A major. Eventually it's going to go. And that's where it ends, right? And it's going to end there. So even when Mozart uses minor keys, he tends to, shall we say, soften the effect, blunt the edge of that minor sound. Whereas a composer like Bach, in fact, more than half of Bach's works, I think about 55% are in minor keys. That's not the case for Mozart. As we said in the first week, it's about 90% of these works are in major keys. Therefore, the minor key ones tend to be especially interesting for us to look at. If we consider the piano concerti, there are 27 of them. This is the only one, this and number 23 are the only ones in minor keys. This is the only one in D minor. The story goes that Mozart wrote this particular piano concerto, and as we can imagine was not an uncommon thing for him, he's running out of time to get the parts copied for the performance. So the story goes that when he premiered this piece, he had only had time to copy out the first two movements for the entire orchestra, and time was running out, so he rushed to copy out the rest of the parts of third movement for the rest of the orchestra, but there was one part he didn't have time to write out, the piano part, the solo part. So he had to perform the whole thing from memory. It's kind of weird to say that because what does that even mean when you when you perform something from memory that you've never played before? Now we might think, well, couldn't he just improvise? And the answer is not really. You'd have to have a map of the piece in your head because you'd have to know exactly what chords come next and what the harmony is going to be, so you'd know how to embellish, where the cadenza is going to fall. Remember, the cadenza is that improvisatory moment at the end. I think this third movement is really, really forward-looking in that it anticipates the minor key sound of the Romantic period. Let's reflect for a minute on how many famous pieces in the next century would be in minor keys, whether it's, you know, the third movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Minor key. Of course, the first movement is in a minor key. Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, also in a minor key, in C minor. Beethoven's Appassionata in F minor. The Tempest Sonata in D minor. The Opus 111 in C minor. Minor keys become really, it's hard to generalize this, so I wouldn't put this in writing, but I would say that in the 19th century, composers really start to embrace the minor sound because it's more expressive somehow, you see, especially for these tortured artist types. Chopin, how many famous Chopin pieces are in minor keys? Well, you've got the Revolutionary Etude, C minor, the Opus 56 Fantasy Impromptu, C sharp minor. The Opus 10 number 4 etude, also C sharp minor. So minor keys are really part of the romantic sound. And I think it's works like this which really hint at that and open the door to these later composers to embrace the expressivity of this darker tonality. So let's just listen to a little bit of this. We won't have time to listen to the whole thing, but just a little bit of it. I'm going to pause it here because we're now going to get into the next section. Mitsuko Uchida, of course, known for two things, I would say. One, terrific Mozart interpretation, and two, terrific facial expressions and gesticulations. This performance, by the way, probably would resemble the way it was performed back in Mozart's day, with one obvious difference, which is that they did not have these big Bösendorf or whatever this is, Steinway 12-foot grand pianos back then. Mozart's piano was, by modern standards, would be considered a flimsy thing, really probably weighed no more than 120 or 150 pounds, primarily made of wood, no iron framing inside, no cross stringing, so it would be a much, you might say, to use a very technical adjective, it would be a much dinkier sound. All right. You can hear the moodiness of this piece, the sort of intensity that's generated by the themes in the piano originally, diminished chords, these tortured intervals of diminished sevenths and tritones and other sounds which are quite unstable and take some time to resolve. One thing I will tell you before we move on is that this one does end in D major. So once again, Mozart can't seem to help himself. Or can he? Well, we're now going to look at the Requiem. The Requiem is a piece that I think people certainly would recognize if they heard at least some parts of it. The Dies Irae, for example, we're going to listen to that. That's a very famous section. The Kyrie, that is a very famous section. And the Lacrimosa, perhaps the most famous section, at least I think, for anyone who's seen the movie Amadeus. That and the Confutatis. What is a Requiem? We should probably start there, right? Because I would guess that not everybody knows, and we could use a refresher even if we do know. A requiem is a mass for the dead. It's a funeral mass. Now, the concept of setting the mass to music was very common. You can go back to the 14th century and find a wonderful example from probably around 1350 by a composer, a French composer named Guillaume de Machaut. I always say, Machaut must go on. Guillaume de Machaut wrote perhaps the first really great musical mass setting. You'll find recurring texts. For those of you who sing in choruses, you probably know these texts by heart. You start with the Kyrie, Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. In a typical mass setting, not in a requiem, you would then go to the Gloria, Gloria in excelsis Dei, et in terra pax hominibus bone voluntatis, which would mean glory to God in the highest and peace on earth and goodwill towards men. You'd get other movements that you'd recognize, Credo, Sanctus. Typically you'd end with the Agnus Dei, Lamb of God, qui tollis peccata mundi, who takes away the sins of the world. But we're going to have some texts here, because it's a requiem, it's going to have some texts which are different. For example, we are going to start with a Kyrie, but before we get the Kyrie, we get a different text. Which you'll hear in a moment. You're going to get a text, for example, the second movement here is the Dies Irae. Dies Irae, it means days of wrath, when the world shall be consumed in ash. And it anticipates the last judgment. So those movements tend to be very fiery movements for composers, whether it's Mozart or nearly a century later, one of my favorite Requiem mass settings from the 19th century by Giuseppe Verdi, a guy not known for writing liturgical music, but for those who know the Verdi Requiem, it really is, I think, by any conceivable standard, a masterpiece. Mozart's, of course, is in that highest tier as well. You're going to get other texts which are part of the Dies Irae, for example, the famous Lacrimosa, which we'll hear at the end of today's program, and Tuba Mirum, Rex Tremendi, Confutatis Maledictis. There's all sorts of texts which are going to be particularly suited to the funeral or the funerary character of the Requiem Mass. Again, Mozart wrote this on an anonymous commission. We know that. In fact, the movie Amadeus uses that as the central plot for the end of the movie, right? Is that Antonio Salieri, the jealous, bitter, resentful composer who's living in Mozart's shadow, sends, actually, he goes himself, which is really preposterous plotline. He should have sent somebody and make it more realistic. But he wears a mask, and he offers Mozart a bag of gold, and he says, if you write this, you'll be well compensated for it. That much is rooted in truth, except the guy who commissioned it anonymously was not Salieri. Sorry, folks. I know it makes for a great movie plot, but it just ain't true, and ain't a word. So what are we supposed to do about this? Well, the real guy was a guy named Franz von Weizscker, who was an aristocrat who lived in the suburbs of Vienna. He was a count, so he had lands and titles, and he was also an enthusiastic musician. He played cello, probably not very well. He spent many an afternoon, we can imagine, whiling away the hours in this affluent lifestyle, hiring better people to play with him. One of his curious habits, and this was a recurring theme with this Weizscker character, is that he loved to commission works anonymously. And he would make sure that one of the provisions in the sort of, let's call it the handshake contract, was that whatever he paid for, he owned. And then what he would do is he would take the score, copy it out in his own hand, which of course would have been recognizable to the musicians whom he played with, and he would try to pass the work off as his own. Now, there were some musicologists in the 20th century who really looked into this guy, and apparently all of the anecdotal evidence suggests that even the people who played with him and his estates and his various palaces and houses did not believe that any of the works that he tried to pass off as his own were actually his. So the thought of him trying to pass off something as impressive as Mozart's Requiem is really preposterous, and I think probably, if anything, it's comical. Nonetheless, he's the man who commissioned the Requiem, and it is rather a sad story because apparently his wife had died. His wife was quite young, and so he tried to get Mozart to write the Requiem, make sure that he had the rights to it, so to speak. Remember, there's no intellectual property laws back then. So if he gets the score and copies it out, he can pass it off on his own. Of course, his plans were thwarted, but not by anybody necessarily, so much as by providence, by fate, by destiny. Mozart was destined to die before he could finish the Requiem. So what did he finish? Well, he finished the first few movements. In fact, he got up to the Lacrimosa, which is the last thing we're going to listen to today. And he didn't even finish that. He wrote the first eight measures. And then we think, as he was dying, he died over a period of probably about 2 weeks, he took his student Süssmayr aside and told Süssmayr exactly, we don't know exactly what he said, but it seems from the early biography, which was written about 10 years after, it's less than that, 8 years, I think it's 1797, that Mozart did instruct his student about how he wanted the piece to end. So why don't we start by listening a little bit to the introduction, and then we'll jump to the Kyrie. So here's how it starts. Dona eis requiem Domine. What does it mean? Lord, grant unto them eternal rest. All right. We'll listen to the next phrase, then we'll jump to the fugue. And notice how Mozart steers us towards a comforting B-flat major on the invocation of eternal light. The action really starts to get going towards the end, so because we have limited time, I want to move to the finale of this opening salvo. Mozart's going to give us a fugue. And we've talked before about how fugues went out of style around 1750 when Bach died. The fugue was considered an arcane musical genre, too complex to be really enjoyed by anybody because it required too much focus, and all of the complex intertwining of simultaneous melody made it impossible to sort of sing along or walk away with a tune in your head. Well, Mozart's going to do exactly this. He's going to use a fugue. Not just here, but later in the Requiem as well, contrapuntal textures will emerge. And in fact, it's not just a fugue, as we're going to see, it's a double fugue. What on earth is a double fugue? Well, it's like a fugue, but it's more complex, because instead of having one theme, which is going to be imitated in sequence, you're going to have two themes. Call them theme A and theme B, if you like. One sounds like this. Kyrie eleison, right? That's the first one, which, by the way, Mozart probably, we think, either it's a coincidence or he borrowed that from Handel's Messiah. For those of you who know part 2 of Handel's Messiah, there's a fugue that starts like this. And with his stripes, same intervals, up a second, diminished seventh down. Yeah. Anyway, that's the first theme. The second theme is going to be faster in you'll see in faster notes sung like this. Christe ele. We call this melismatic singing when you have lots of notes. Lots of notes on a single syllable or word. So here is the lead up to the fugue. It's quite a tour de force, and maybe perhaps some of us are picking up on some of the things I mentioned earlier about why this contrapuntal style of music went out of fashion 40 or 50 years before Mozart was writing it, because it's difficult music to listen to. And if you didn't have a score, imagine it would be even more difficult. We would have a really tough time, I think, separating the different strands, hearing when the theme enters in which voice, when the counter subject enters in which voice. And of course, this is coming from a guy who didn't really write polyphonic contrapuntal music, although, of course, when he wanted to, as we see here, he really could. There's a famous story about Mozart. He had a patron, somebody by the name of Gottfried von Swieten, who happened to hold the title of Baron and who happened to be an enthusiastic collector of musical manuscripts. And it just so happened that this Gottfried von Swieten had collected some Bach manuscripts, including some of the motets, which are very complex pieces. The story goes he invites Mozart over to his library and he says, I want you to look at something. And he gives Mozart the score. Now, back then, they didn't have these sort of convenient master scores necessarily. You were stuck with parts. So if you sang soprano, you got the soprano part. That's it. Which meant if you got lost, too bad. Better luck next time. Well, what Mozart apparently did, looking through this, having his ears and his musical mind, he arranged all four parts. Now, these are 4 different pages, not just 4 different staves, but 4 pages of music on the piano, and began to sight read the piece. And then he turns to von Swieten when he gets to the first cadence and he says, now here's something everyone can learn from. So his esteem for Bach seems to have been substantial. And this is always funny to compare to an earlier quote from when he was just barely making it out of his teens. He wrote a letter to his father and he said, Bach is the father, we are the children. Now that doesn't sound so strange, except that he wasn't talking about Johann Sebastian Bach. He was talking about Johann Christian Bach, or as he was known back then, Johnny Bach. Johann Christian Bach would spend the end of his career in London. All right, let's take a look at the next movement here. We'll switch to the live thing, and then we'll talk about it. Here's a period authentic performance of the piece, and we're going to pick up now with the Dies Irae. The Dies Irae I mentioned earlier is typically one of the highlights of any Requiem setting because of the text. The text is so evocative and imaginative that the text is so evocative that it allows an imaginative composer to use all sorts of really expressive sounds. And because the text is talking about judgment and the world being consumed in ash, you can imagine that composers are really going to go hog wild with this. And that's true of Mozart. It's going to be especially true in the next century. But I think it starts with Mozart, the idea of really using the Dies Irae as one of the real showstopper moments in the piece. So many of you will recognize this. It's been used in TV commercials and movies and so on and so forth. That's a wild ride. And once again, it's tying into this narrative, which I hope to be articulating here, which is how Mozart's later works, some of these movements, some of these excerpts that we've been listening to really seem to be anticipating sounds that would become very popular in the next century. That is to say, Mozart died in 1791. By 1805, 1810, composers are really starting to embrace this minor mode, dissonance, a lot of instability, diminished chords, and we see it in these late works in spades. The last thing that Mozart said, apparently, was that he knew he was going to die and that he could taste death in his mouth, which is a strange thing to say. And we get this, by the way, from Mozart's sister-in-law, Sophie. There were not many people present at his funeral. When he died on December 5th, 1791, he was buried the way that most people were buried in Vienna, unless you had a lot of money and you could afford to buy a grave that would be unperturbed, because you see, back then, if you were buried in a common grave, there was an agreement with the city that after 10 years, they could come and reclaim the land for some other purpose if they wanted to resell the land for more burials, for example. Mozart was buried under, I would say, very sad circumstances, not just because he was so young, but because so few people were there when he died. Probably just a grieving, inconsolable widow, Constanza, perhaps his mother-in-law, the Baron Gottfried von Swieten, who I just mentioned, the man who introduced him to some of the works of Johann Sebastian Bach, Emanuel Schikaneder, the librettist of the Magic Flute, and perhaps a few others. I really like the way that Milos Forman framed this scene in the movie Amadeus, and it just so happens that I have it available. So while we listen to the Lacrimosa, instead of watching and looking at the score or looking at a typical performance, let's hear the music as it's performed and as it frames this particular scene, which is one of the last scenes in the movie, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So here's F. Murray Abraham in this inimitable performance playing Antonio Salieri, and Salieri's plan to steal the Requiem, he feels it slipping away from his grasp because he's just realized, as has Constanza, who's in the room, that Mozart has in fact died. And so we'll see the Lacrimosa starts to play as soon as we find out that he's dead. We start to hear the opening strains, and it seems to fit perfectly. Freeze frame. Antonio Salieri, 30 years in the future. And of course, I won't go into how the plot is framed through this sort of dialogue that Salieri has with the priest, but I want to share one line which we don't have here, but I'll tell you what it is anyway. Salieri here has survived Mozart by more than 30 years, and he's an elderly gentleman, and he's had to live in those 30 years watching his music fade into oblivion while Mozart's music experienced a surge of popularity which started after his death and I think has never stopped. And so what he says to the priest is supposed to be hearing his confession, and instead the priest is rendered speechless by the story. So while the priest is completely sort of catatonic after hearing this tale about Mozart, Salieri says to him, "Don't worry, Father, I will speak for you. I speak for all mediocrities. I am their champion. I am their patron saint." It's a wonderful way to end the movie, and it's a wonderful way to tie up this series, because we come back and circle around to this idea of genius. And I imagine some of you will have some questions, so feel free. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to say, for those who have to leave, that you've been a wonderful audience, and thank you so much for having me these 4 weeks, especially for those who have come out in the winter, these winter nights. We never know what we're going to get, so it's so great to see the room so well represent so many community members here to talk about this really fascinating figure and to learn more about this music, which continues to grip us 230 plus years after it was written. First question. Yeah, good question. Is it true that he never edited his music, that he never made revisions? It's strictly speaking, it's not true. There are isolated examples where he does make changes. The Kegelstadt clarinet trio is a good example of that, the only one that I can think of the 626 pieces in the catalog. However, it's basically true. It might as well be true. Mozart seems to have had this facility to just compose, and whatever came out on the page was correct. He didn't have to sort of reassess and, well, what do I want to do here? Whereas someone like Beethoven really had to think about what key he wanted to do it. And he'd write it in D minor and then go back and say, D minor is just not the right character. Let's change it. Well, I want to revoice this chord. Well, I want to put this theme in the bassoon rather than in the cello or whatever it was. Mozart didn't have that issue, let's call it. Good question. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, great question. The question is about Mozart's personality as it's depicted in the film and whether I think it's accurate. Well, in as much as Mozart did have a fascination with the scatological, it is correct in that. Mozart did have a high-pitched giggle that often came out at inappropriate times. Many people who knew him wrote about that. His sister wrote about it. His cousin wrote about it. Some of his fellow Freemasons wrote about it. So the giggle, which is a central sort of recurring comic thing in the movie, that's true. And the interest in sort of toilet jokes, that's also true. So I think the movie does a pretty good job. And also, let's give credit where credit is due. Tom Hulce, who plays Mozart here, does a fantastic job. For someone to walk into this role, that's not an easy thing to do. And I don't know if he did any research or how he fit this role, but he seems to really nail it. So as far as the movie goes in depicting Mozart as somewhat childish and mischievous and even churlish and immature, probably not far off. Yeah, as much as we would like to think of Mozart as this infallible, sophisticated guy, he really wasn't. Question. Requiem was first performed at a benefit concert hosted by Constanze Mozart. She was a really savvy businesswoman, as it turned out, and I believe the year 1792 in Vienna or in Prague, where Mozart also had a devoted following. But it was right after he died, within the next year or two, and it was done with the gumption and elbow grease of his wife, who undertook this project to have a benefit concert. She needed to raise money for herself and her two sons, and so she used her husband's legacy and his great sort of repertoire of music he had left. So that's when the Requiem was first done. And it was completed by his student Zismeyer, although there is some debate about how much of it Zismeyer actually completed. Sir, and we're going to come around. Well, how difficult is it to perform Mozart? It's a great question because it could be answered with really two very different answers. Let me quote, first I'm going to quote Vladimir Horowitz, who one of the great pianists of the 20th century. Horowitz famously said that Mozart, for pianists at least, is best performed either when you're under the age of 15 or over the age of 75. I would say that his keyboard works are easier than, say, Beethoven's, or certainly easier than Chopin's. They're easier because the style is just different. I would say his vocal works are harder. The operatic arias are extremely demanding, especially for those who were with us last week when we looked at Der Hölle Rache kocht in meinem Herzen from the Magic Flute, or any of the ensemble numbers from Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni. Those are really tough vocal numbers to work out. So it really depends on the piece. The concertos are hard. Those parts are not easy to learn. Yeah, it's not as hard as the Grieg concerto, but they're difficult. It's not Tchaikovsky, but it's apples and oranges because those are from much later on down the road. So I would say, generally speaking, the keyboard works, the solo keyboard works are not terribly difficult. The string quartets, for example, are not terribly difficult, but that's if we compare them to later generations of composers. But the vocal works, I think, stand out as being quite difficult to pull off. Sir. Well, should we do that? Well, as the program director happens to be in the room with us, Mallory, we'll work on it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think we could definitely tackle Beethoven for sure. Peter, and then we'll come over here. Yeah, the question is about sort of the purpose, the objective in some way. When they write a piece of music, do you write with a venue in mind? Certainly with a requiem, with liturgical music in general, you would. And you'd think about those high ceilings and stone walls and floors, and you think about how the sound is going to ping back and forth in that very wet, resonant space. And maybe that lends itself to a certain style of music. I think also, knowing that it would be performed in a church, maybe that also inspired him to tackle a more contrapuntal style, employ that sort of polyphonic Bach-esque style, because it would sound very appropriate being played in a church, being sung in a church. Yeah. I think that's a terrific question. Why was Mozart's music not so popular in his own lifetime? I think it's really hard to answer that question, by the way. So it's any question that's hard to answer is usually a good one. Let me suggest a few reasons why it was not popular. Number one, the Viennese crowd, from everything the scholarship tells us from the 1780s on, was a very fickle crowd. They really loved whatever was new and shiny and hadn't been done before. Once you got to town, you were the toast of town, but only for a certain amount of time. And once Mozart had been there for 5 years, he was considered, a veteran of the area. That's one reason, is the fickleness of the Viennese audience, the capriciousness, and that gets repeated over and over again. You read one chronicle, one history after another, and just about everybody seems to mention it. Mozart complains bitterly about it in at least a half dozen letters. That's number one. Number two, powerful sort of political figures who are working behind the scenes. People like Salieri, people like Giuseppe Bonno, who is the director of opera, people like Count Orsini Rosenberg, people who probably didn't like Mozart so much because, as I mentioned earlier, addressing the question of his character, he might have come off as somewhat abrasive and churlish. And these older sort of establishment figures didn't like that. So it was probably a combination of his lack of social grace, the capriciousness of the audience, and also that he was living in a time when, music and purpose were changing dramatically. Take a work like Marriage of Figaro. It's a work that, as a central plot, you got the guy, the main antagonist, Count Almaviva, getting humiliated by his servant, Figaro, a barber. That's a really controversial thing to do in 1786 when you're just a couple of years away from the French Revolution. So the powers that be, the people who put on these operas, are not going to be keen to keep them hot and keep those concert halls filled, because it's a topic which is really sensitive to them. And if they're watching a play like Don Giovanni, an opera where the title character, who has this title of Lord Giovanni, he's an aristocrat and he gets dragged to hell at the end. You see what I mean about the timing being off a little bit? Great question. So the first question, do we know where Mozart's buried? Yes. In fact, he was exhumed at some point in the 19th century, and his skull was studied. They did this with Bach as well in Leipzig. They didn't discover anything abnormal about it, except that he may have, there's one theory that was published, I think, in a medical journal in 2001, that he might have died of, I don't even know, a subdural hematoma or something like that. I maybe I'm getting that completely wrong. As far as who gets his music, who inherits his music, right now the answer is everyone in this room. Mozart's music is in the public domain. So anything he wrote, you have access to, every one of us has access to through the IMSLP website, which is the International Music Score Library Project. So that's the answer to that. Now, as far as who would have inherited it in his day, his wife. And she would have passed it on to their two sons. Now, oddly enough, tragically enough perhaps, neither of his sons married. And of course, they didn't have children. So the Mozart line ended sometime around 1858, which is heavy to think about. Yeah, that's right. The question is about period instruments and performance authenticity. Well, all right, disclosure. I went to college and graduate school in the Boston area. And the Boston area is, of course, famous for its embrace of period authenticity. There are groups there, for example, like Emmanuel Music. They perform Bach cantatas every Sunday, and they do it with original instruments in a church, right in the, between the nave and the transept, just like Bach would have done it. There are groups like the Handel and Haydn Society, Boston Baroque. There are people like Martin Perlman and Daniel Stepner who are up there directing ensembles. So when I was really coming up and learning all this music and getting acquainted with it on a serious level, it was always period authentic. So when I started going on YouTube and looking at videos of someone like Carl Richter back in the 70s doing the St. Matthew Passion with 300 people and lots of heavy vibrato in the singers, I just thought it sounded weird. Preposterous even. Why would anybody do that? You would do the St. Matthew Passion, no more than perhaps, 25 singers and as many musicians, 50 people total. Why do we need 300 people? And why would you sing Bach with vibrato? Well, they just didn't know that back then. So for me, I love the sound of a period orchestra. I love the sound of period instruments. For me, I really appreciate it more with Baroque instruments. I don't really, care if they play Mozart using a Anton Stadler's model for the clarinet from 1790, or whether it's a modern clarinet. It doesn't interest me so much. For me, I really hear the difference more and therefore appreciate it more with Baroque instruments. But that's a great question, though. I haven't heard a question about that in a while. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I love the period orchestra, especially with Baroque music. Let me leave you with this. Mozart had it all and wound up, well, not exactly like he's depicted in the movie, but probably something very close to that. So what does it tell us? What does it tell us? Well, I think we can take the answer perhaps from, of all characters, Antonio Salieri. Because let's face it, most of us are not Mozart. I think that's fair to say. But if we're lucky enough to know somebody who has a drop of that genius, a drop of that supreme ability, facility, knowledge, whatever it is, it can be very daunting for us, whether it's a sibling or friend or a neighbor or whoever it is. And I think that it's not so hard to understand why Salieri had this nervous breakdown later in his life when he was plagued by rumors that he was the one who had poisoned Mozart. He must have known that this was just the gossip mill churning, and they were looking for something fantastic and sensational to explain the demise of this of this fantastic musician. But for him, I don't think it was the rumors of his supposed conspiracy to kill Mozart. I think it was living 30 years, actually 32 years he lived past Mozart's death, knowing that he would become irrelevant if he wasn't already. And I think maybe that's what I take away from this more than anything else, that all of the wealth and the lifestyle that Mozart didn't enjoy, all of that is ephemeral. The fact of the matter is, here we are across the Atlantic Ocean in 2018, and we're talking about Mozart. And we're reflecting on it, and we're appreciating the music, perhaps in a new way, in a new dimension. And that's a testament to the value of this music. I'm often asked, why classical music? And the answer lies in the meaning of the word classic. What does it mean? It means timeless. For me, and I think for most people, if not everybody in this room, Mozart is timeless. So I'll see everybody for Beethoven.